On the 28th of April 1945, the former fascist dictator of Italy, Benito Mussolini, was ordered to get out of a truck as an executioner prepared his machine gun. Mussolini was executed alongside his longtime mistress, Clara Petacci, and their remains were then taken into the centre of Milan for a gruesome public display. They were dumped unceremoniously in the centre of the public square, and thousands there subjected the remains to a brutal posthumous ordeal in which they were battered. Mussolini's body was shot at, and some spat and even threw human waste at it. His corpse was unrecognisable because of the beating, and it was then strung up upside down from a half-built service station as the crowd jeered and threw further objects at it. It was the American forces who took possession of his remains, but during the autopsy, part of Mussolini was stolen and was then taken to the States for further analysis, and today the exact whereabouts as to where part of Mussolini's brain is remains debated. But what is the shocking story of his brain, and why was it taken? To support, please make sure to subscribe. Following the public shaming and display of Mussolini's remains, the American soldiers ordered the body of he and his mistress Clara Petacci to be cut down from the service station. It was said that this was done as for the first time the common people could reach out and touch their untouchable leader. This sort of ordeal had been performed upon the remains, as it was a symbol of shame used since the medieval period inside of Italy, but after the American soldiers had loaded the corpses onto the back of the truck, they took them to Milan's city mortuary for them to be stored briefly. It was here where an American photographer took some very macabre images of the pair, and even arranged Petacci and Mussolini to be arm in arm in death, their brutalised corpses being altered. But following the images being taken, an autopsy was performed on Mussolini's misshapen and battered body. It was carried out at the University of Milan, and it was discovered that his misshapen head had been caused by the destruction of his cranium, and he had suffered severe damage to the cerebellum, midbrain, and parts of the occipital lobes in his brain. This had been sustained posthumously, as we know he was executed by gunshot, and that his ordeal in the square in Milan had caused severe damage to Mussolini's brain and the rest of his body. But the Americans wanted part of the brain of the dictator to subject it to different tests and treatments. Allegedly, one of the reasons why the brain of Mussolini was cut from his head and then sent to America was to see if he suffered from a bout of untreated syphilis, as was rumoured. Some believed that the erratic and outlandish behaviour of the dictator could have been put down to a brain injury suffered or general paresis. Dr. Winfried Overholzer was the one who wanted to test this, and he requested parts of Mussolini's brain, and he would receive these. Months later, inside of the Italian Institute of Legal Medicine, Mussolini's brain was divided up, and in test tubes, part of his brain was sent to the States, and specifically Washington, D.C. Dr. Overholzer and Dr. Webb Haymaker at the Army Institute of Pathology began to look at Mussolini's brain, and they were looking for brain damage, and whether to see if he had suffered from syphilis, and whether this had caused issues with his brain. They were also interested to see if the brain of the dictator was different to that of a normal person. The researchers believed that Mussolini, after studying the brain, was not affected with paresis, and that there was no visible brain damage sustained before his posthumous ordeal in the Milan square. As far as the look and structure of Mussolini's brain, it was claimed that this could have actually been that of a reasonably healthy human. The researchers came to the conclusion that in fact Mussolini wasn't mentally ill, just a rather strange person who had bizarre personality traits and a penchant for the extravagance, and they stated that he was not mentally ill or suffering with any illness that did alter his brain and decision-making. After this, the study of Mussolini's brain was shut down, as they had reached their conclusions, and the parts of Mussolini's grey matter were sent to St. Elizabeth Hospital in Washington, and they were also kept inside the Armed Forces Institute of Pathology. 10 years later, the story of Mussolini's brain emerged again, as a reporter for a newspaper had heard about the gruesome parts of the dictator that had been kept inside American archives. This reporter wanted to test the story about whether the researchers had actually performed the study on the brain, and he went to see Dr. Overholzer to ask him directly. Overholzer did not say too much, however he simply just went over to his safe inside of his office, and he opened it and pulled out a small glass vial. The reporter then claimed that, floating in the bottle, in preservative, was something resembling a chicken liver. The label on the bottle sent one's thoughts back to the dictator's ignominious end. The label read, Mussolini's brain. That reporter, John McElway, was the final person to see this part of Mussolini's brain. The report he created shocked many people inside of Washington and America, but over the next few years the story of his brain was forgotten. But of course, in the time since the death of Mussolini, other parts of the Italian dictator had also gone missing. Mussolini's body following his burial was unearthed by a former fascist journalist, and the remains were then hidden for many years inside different religious houses and villas until they appeared inside of a church. They were then stored inside a Capuchin monastery by the Italian authorities very quietly, and in 1957, 12 years after his death, Mussolini was finally returned to the Mussolini family crypt, but there was parts of him missing, his leg, and his brain had also obviously been taken, but the whereabouts of the leg is also a mystery today. Rachele Mussolini, the dictator's wife, wanted her dictator husband to be returned in one piece, and this included his brain, and she wrote to the United States ambassador to Italy for many years and demanded that her husband's brain be returned to her. In 1966, a decision was taken to deal with this, and US government officials managed to locate half of the brain cuttings of the dictator's grey matter inside the Armed Forces Institute of Pathology. However, they could not find any of the brain kept in Dr. Overholzer's safe or inside of St. Elizabeth Hospital, and with this it's believed that the brain of Mussolini, in this regard, had been taken away and hidden. But the journalist who wrote the report was certain that he had been shown the parts of Mussolini's brain. He testified he had seen this, and the chief of St. Elizabeth later confirmed that part of Mussolini's brain had been taken to the hospital for research. But what happened to the half of the brain in the possession of Dr. Overholzer remains a mystery today, especially in the years following his death. The American authorities did send the parts of Mussolini's brain that they could find to Rachele Mussolini, his widow in Italy, and they arrived in Florence in a white envelope with the misspelt surname of the dictator on it. The family then returned the brain to the tomb in the vault, and it was said by his daughter, "He had an unusual destiny, my father even in death. His body was shipped like merchandise in a packing crate, and his brain in an envelope like a special delivery letter." The brain parts of Mussolini had been for over 20 years in America, and they were then placed in a box above his tomb, to the right of the marble bust of his head. But what happened to the other half of the brain? This relic of the former fascist dictator would be incredibly valuable to some people, and it was either stolen or lost inside of the hospital's archives. However, in 2009, shockingly an advert appeared on eBay claiming to list samples of Mussolini's brain for sale, and they had a price listing of $22,000, and it was believed by Mussolini's granddaughter that these could have been the missing samples of his brain that were sent to Washington's hospital, but the listing was then removed swiftly. Still today there is part of Mussolini's brain that was taken 80 years ago at the end of the Second World War, and it is missing. It's unlikely that this would have been destroyed because of the significance of it. It is possible that it still remains inside of a private collection today, possibly passed down from a doctor who did the experiments. But Mussolini's posthumous ordeal was brutal. Following his execution, he was subjected to a rough beating at the hands of the angry Italian people, and his brain was then taken from his corpse, and part was sent to the States for experimentation and analysis. But still today what happened to the final parts of Mussolini's brain remain a mystery that one day possibly will be solved, and there are still calls by his family to reunite the missing parts of the dictator and bring them to his tomb, including his leg and the final bits of brain matter. Thanks for watching. To support our channel, please make sure to subscribe, and once again, thank you so much for watching.